Your Dutch oven's secret, the 200-year Amish bread method that bakes fresh loaves while you sleep. Most people think they know what this means. They think it's about mixing dough on Sunday, leaving it in a cold refrigerator, pulling it out on Wednesday to bake. Simple math, slow fermentation, cold equals flavor. That story's been everywhere for the past 15 years. But there's something much deeper happening inside that Dutch oven. Something the fermentation blogs and the bread videos never quite explain. Something that changes everything about how your cast iron actually works in the process. Stay with me, because by the end of this video I'm going to show you the real mechanism, the one that matters, and it'll fundamentally shift how you think about your Dutch oven's role in this entire tradition. If you've got a Dutch oven sitting in your cabinet right now, especially one your grandmother left you, I'd love to hear what you use it for in the comments. Do you bake in it? Have you ever tried this method? Drop a line below and let me know your story, because this tradition lives in those tools, and I want to hear yours. Wait, this part is crucial. Most of what we hear about this bread method focuses on the dough, the fermentation, the bacteria and wild yeasts doing their slow work, the actual science of flavor development. That's all real. That's all happening. But here's what gets left out. The Dutch oven isn't just a container. It's not just a lid that traps steam. If that were true, any sealed pot would work the same way, and we both know that's not how this turns out. Cast iron, real cast iron, seasoned cast iron, the kind that's been passed down. It has thermal mass. It has history built into its surface, and when you place cold dough into a screaming hot Dutch oven, something happens that changes the bread from the very first second. The oven works differently because the cast iron itself is different. The thermal conductivity isn't uniform. Cast iron heats slowly and releases heat slowly. A stainless steel pot spikes to temperature and stays volatile. Cast iron develops a stable, sustained heat environment, the kind of environment that allows a wet, underdeveloped dough to expand rapidly without the crust setting too fast. Modern cookware engineers don't talk about this in bread-making terms, but this is exactly what the Pennsylvania Dutch families discovered by accident over 200 years, maybe 300, of working with cast iron and Dutch ovens. They didn't have a thermometer. They didn't have food science. They had cast iron. They had Dutch ovens. They had weekly bread needs and limited time, so they adapted their method around what the tools could do. This is where the sleeping part comes in, not just because the dough ferments passively in the refrigerator, but because the Dutch oven itself, once it's hot, maintains a consistent thermal environment for the entire bake. No spikes, no cooling, just steady, even heat that the cast iron naturally provides. A bread cookbook will tell you that steam is the secret. That's partially true, but the steam alone, without the thermal stability of the vessel holding it, doesn't create that result. You need both. You need the dough development, you need the time, and you need the tool that was designed, or rather, discovered through repeated use, to handle this specific job. The reason old families kept their Dutch ovens seasoned religiously wasn't just about preventing rust. A properly seasoned Dutch oven conducts and retains heat more evenly than a newer one. The seasoning builds a microstructure that affects how the oven releases that heat. I know that sounds overstated. It's not. A cast iron Dutch oven that's been used for 40 years behaves differently than one fresh from the factory. That's not nostalgia. That's material science. Now, I'm not saying you can't bake bread in a new Dutch oven. You absolutely can. You get decent bread. But if you've inherited an old one, if you've got one from an estate sale, if someone left you their grandmother's pot, you're not just getting a historical artifact, you're getting a tool that's been thermally optimized through decades of use. That tool is part of the bread-making equation. The method the Pennsylvania Dutch developed, it wasn't just about timing or ingredients. It was about understanding how their tools worked, how cast iron in particular worked, and building a bread tradition that took advantage of what those tools could do. That's why the bread tastes different from your new stand mixer and conventional oven. That's why Esther's loaves, made the same way her great-grandmother made them, come out tasting like something specific, something connected to a place and a family and a material that's been speaking the same language for generations. The Dutch oven isn't a set piece in the story, it's a character, and once you understand its role, you start baking differently. You start thinking about the dough differently. You start understanding why this method has survived at all. Here's where the method actually begins, not with fancy ingredients or special equipment, but with what you already have at home. The dough itself is forgiving, almost brutally so. You mix flour, water, salt, and a pinch of commercial yeast. That's it. No sourdough starter you've been nursing for months. No special bread flour shipped from some artisanal mill. Flour from your pantry, water from your tap, salt from the box you've had since the Reagan administration. The proportions are loose enough that a quarter cup more or less of water won't ruin anything. You're aiming for wet dough. Shaggy, sticky. The kind of dough that looks wrong if you're used to kneading. You stir it for maybe 5 minutes until the flour's hydrated. Then you cover the bowl and walk away. Now, the Pennsylvania Dutch understood something about time that modern America has largely forgotten. They knew that fermentation doesn't require your attention, it requires your patience. The dough sits in that cool refrigerator for days, sometimes a week. The cold slows the yeast down to a crawl, which sounds like a problem, until you realize what's actually happening underneath that slow fermentation. Flavor is developing. The dough is breaking down its own gluten network. Organic acids are accumulating. The structure is strengthening itself without your hands ever touching it again. You're not fighting the dough or forcing it into submission through aggressive kneading. You're letting chemistry and time do the work while you live your Tuesday. Before we continue, I need to be clear about something important. This isn't some modern shortcut dressed up as tradition. This is actually closer to how bread was made before electric ovens and commercial yeast became universal. When a Pennsylvania Dutch grandmother in 1880 mixed up a batch of dough on Sunday evening, she didn't have a kitchen timer or a temperaturely controlled home. She mixed the dough cool because her kitchen was cool. It fermented slowly because slow fermentation was the only kind available to her. The yeast was whatever natural fermentation lived in her flour and her starter, which meant it moved at a glacial pace compared to modern commercial yeast. What Esther's doing now is a modern adaptation of that same principle. The refrigerator is just replacing what winter and cool kitchens used to do naturally. The commercial yeast is just replacing what sourdough starter did, slowly and unpredictably. The outcome is nearly identical. Bread that tastes like something, not like air in a plastic bag. When you're ready to bake, and this is the part that feels almost too simple, you pull the crock from the cold. Scoop out maybe a pound of dough, flour your hands and the counter, shape it roughly into a round, not a tight, perfect ball, rough, organic, the kind of shape that tells you this came from a human hand, not a machine. The dough goes onto parchment paper. The Dutch oven goes into your oven. You're preheating both together to 450 degrees Fahrenheit. While that's happening, the dough sits on the counter for maybe 15 minutes. Not a long proof. Just enough time for it to relax and warm up slightly from its cold storage. Then the moment arrives. The Dutch oven is screaming hot. The dough is ready. You slide the parchment with the dough directly into that cast iron vessel. Drop the lid on top. Set your timer for 30 minutes. The next 30 minutes are pure chemistry. The Dutch oven traps steam. That steam does something to the dough that an ordinary oven simply cannot replicate. The surface gelatinizes, the crust forms. Inside, the heat pushes through the dough at its own pace, and the structure that's been developing all week long in that refrigerator finally gets its moment. At 30 minutes, the lid comes off. Another 15 minutes in the open oven, and the crust browns. It hardens. It becomes something that cracks when you break it open. The kind of crust that costs $12 at a bakery in a city where people care about these things. You just made it for the price of flour and salt. When that lid comes off, the smell alone tells you everything worked. Not the yeasty smell of commercial bread, something deeper, fermentation, caramelization, the kind of aroma that pulls people into the kitchen from 3 rooms away. Your spouse appears in the doorway, your grandchild stops whatever they were doing. That smell is a conversation. It is memory, it is proof that you did this right. The final 15 minutes without the lid are what separate a decent loaf from something extraordinary. The moisture that's been trapped all that time now escapes. The heat can finally reach the surface directly. The crust darkens, it develops color, mahogany, deep brown, the kind of finish that tells anyone who sees it that this was not made from a bread machine, and definitely not from a supermarket shelf. Pull that loaf out and place it on a wire rack. Do not cut into it for at least 20 minutes. This is where patience tests you. The bread is still cooking internally. The crumb is still setting. Slice it too early and you trap steam inside, and the texture becomes gummy instead of open and alive. Wait, and the structure locks in. When you finally do cut into it, the knife should glide through with a gentle crunch, and inside you find those irregular holes, the open crumb structure that commercial yeast breads simply do not develop. That is the signature of long fermentation. That is the trademark of doing this right. Now, before we move to how to actually build this system into your routine, I need to circle back to something essential. The old Amish bread tradition, the one my great-grandmother kept alive, that was weekly baking. 1 day a week, Saturday afternoon, and the entire week's bread came out of the oven in one session. Modern adapted version that Esther uses, the no-need cold fermentation method, it allows something different. You bake whenever you want. You keep the dough in the refrigerator. You pull out what you need. It is flexibility that the traditional method did not offer. But, and this matters, there is a trade-off. The traditional method produced a slightly different loaf, firmer crumb, more sour if a sourdough starter was used, different flavor profile entirely. Esther's version trades some of that depth for convenience. You gain the ability to have fresh bread any day you choose. You lose some of the intensity that comes from a true wild yeast fermentation over 5, 6, 7 days at room temperature. I mention this because people sometimes ask me, after they have made the bread a few times, why does mine not taste exactly like the loaves my grandmother made in 1952? The answer is not technique failure on your part. The answer is that your grandmother was using a different system entirely. She was pulling flavor from a living culture, from days of room temperature fermentation, from practices that required a different kind of discipline and knowledge. Esther's method is not trying to recreate that. It is trying to honor the principle: slow fermentation, minimal handling, letting time do the work, while fitting into a modern kitchen schedule. Both are legitimate. Both grow from the same root. They are not identical. The question then becomes practical. You have a crock or a covered bowl with a pound of fermented dough in your refrigerator right now. You know how to shape it. You know how to bake it. The thing you need to know is how often can you actually use this system? How many loaves can one batch of dough produce? And here is where the beauty of this method reveals itself in full. That initial batch you made, call it 5 cups of flour mixed with water and a 1/4 teaspoon of yeast. That creates enough dough for roughly 8 to 10 individual loaves if you portion them carefully. 8 to 10 loaves. From one 5-minute mixing session, you can pull out a pound, shape it, bake it, pull out another pound 3 days later, another the day after that. The dough actually improves as it sits. The flavor deepens. The structure tightens. By day 6 or 7, when you are pulling out the last portions, you have bread that is noticeably better than the loaf you baked on day 2. This is where the Amish understanding of time becomes most useful. They do not think of bread as something you make once a week. They think of it as something that lives in your kitchen, a living thing that feeds your family continuously. Marta Stolzfus, who bakes for a community kitchen outside Ephrata, once told me that she thinks of her dough crock the same way she thinks of her sourdough starter, as an ongoing conversation with fermentation, not as a project with a start date and an end date. 1 crock. 8 to 10 loaves across 7 days. That means roughly 5 minutes of shaping work per loaf, spread across the week. Never a full day of baking. Never a frantic Saturday afternoon in a hot kitchen. Instead, Monday you pull a pound and bake. Wednesday you pull a pound and bake. Friday you pull a pound and bake. The rhythm becomes automatic. Your family stops expecting store bread on Tuesday because they know fresh bread is coming Wednesday morning. Now, before we continue, and this part matters, you need to understand what happens to the dough's behavior as fermentation progresses. Day 2. The dough is tight and cooperative. It holds its shape. Day 6. The dough is looser, wetter, almost slack. Some home bakers panic at this point. They think the dough has gone bad. It has not. It has simply matured. The yeast has consumed most of the available sugars. The bacterial cultures have produced acids that have weakened the gluten structure slightly, but also deepened the flavor to something almost nutty. A loaf from day 6 tastes measurably different from a loaf from day 2, and most people prefer it. The trade is this: slightly looser handling in exchange for noticeably better bread. You adjust your shaping technique slightly, you move a bit faster, with slightly damper hands. You do not fight the dough, you work with its nature at that stage of fermentation. The Dutch oven handles both equally well, because the enclosed steam environment does not depend on the dough's firmness. The loaf expands, the heat creates steam, the bread rises and sets. The method is forgiving in that way. Cast iron does work that modern bakers have had to rediscover through trial and error, but Amish bakers have understood for generations. Here is what that means for your kitchen. You make 1 batch of dough on Sunday afternoon, 5 minutes of work. You cover it with a cloth, you set it in the refrigerator. For the next week, you have fresh bread available whenever you want it, not whenever the dough is ready, whenever you decide your family needs it. You control the schedule. The dough ferments on your time. Some families keep a simple rotation. They pull dough every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. 3 loaves a week from 1 Sunday batch. Other families pull every other day. Some pull just once or twice if they are smaller households. The point is that you decide. Not the yeast, not the fermentation timeline. You. Samuel King, who runs a farm stand in Bird in Hand, told me he and his wife Sarah use 2 ceramic crocks. They stagger them. 1 crock goes into the cold on week 1. The second crock starts fermenting while the first is being used. By the time the first crock is empty at the end of week 2, the second crock is ready to start producing. Continuous bread, never a day without fresh dough in storage. That system requires nothing special. No special equipment, no expensive setup. 2 ceramic crocks you might find at an estate auction for $5 each. 1 Dutch oven. 1 bag of active dry yeast. 1 container of salt. Everything else is flour and water. The barrier between you and fresh bread every single day is not money or skill. It is understanding how fermentation time replaces active work time. It is understanding that a Pennsylvania Dutch kitchen from 1920 was not more advanced than yours. It was simpler, and in that simplicity, there was freedom. The moment you grasp this principle, everything shifts. Fermentation is not waiting. It is work happening without you. Your job is to understand the temperature, the timing, and the signal that tells you the dough is ready. Those 3 things unlock the entire system. Temperature controls speed. A cold refrigerator slows fermentation dramatically. Room temperature accelerates it. A cool basement ferments slower still. The Pennsylvania Dutch knew their kitchens intimately. They knew which shelf stayed coldest. They knew how long a crock could sit before the dough became over-fermented and began to collapse. This knowledge was passed from mother to daughter, not written in cookbooks. It lived in observation. It lived in failure and correction. Your refrigerator probably holds dough at around 38 to 40 degrees. At that temperature, a wet dough will ferment slowly enough to last 5 to 7 days without souring or collapsing. The exact window depends on your yeast, your flour, and how much salt you added. Trial teaches you where your refrigerator settles. The first time you leave dough for 6 days, you learn whether 6 days is too long in your setup. The second time, you adjust. Here is what most home cooks miss about heritage cooking. They assume it was rigid. They think an Amish grandmother followed a written recipe with exact temperatures and timing. She did not. She followed signals. She watched the dough. She smelled it. She poked it with her finger. She tasted a crumb. Her hands knew what was happening because she had made thousands of loaves. The recipe was not the point. The relationship with the dough was the point. Before we continue, I need to be direct about something. You will fail the first time. The dough might over-ferment. The bread might come out dense. The crust might not blister properly. That is not a sign you should abandon the method. That is a sign the method is working exactly as it should. It is teaching you through experience, the same way it taught hundreds of thousands of families across the Midwest and Mid-Atlantic for nearly 2 centuries. When you shape the dough and let it rest on the counter, the oven needs to reach a specific temperature. Most bread bakers use 475 to 500 degrees. The cast iron Dutch oven sits inside the oven while it preheats. The goal is a brutally hot enclosed space. When you slide the cold dough into that heat, the exterior begins to set, while steam trapped inside pushes the dough upward. This is called oven spring. It happens in the first 10 to 15 minutes. After that, the crust firms and browning begins. The lid stays on for roughly 25 to 30 minutes. The steam stays trapped. The bread does not dry out. The crust stays soft enough to expand. Then the lid comes off, and the loaf bakes uncovered for another 15 to 20 minutes until the crust is deep brown, and knocking it with your knuckle sounds hollow. 45 to 50 minutes total in the oven. That is the entire active baking time from the moment cold dough meets hot iron. Everything before that, the mixing, the fermenting, the waiting, happens on its own. Your hands touch the dough for maybe 4 minutes on the day you bake. This is the secret I promised you at the beginning. The real inheritance is not the recipe itself. It is the understanding that fermentation collapses the barrier between intention and outcome. You decide on Tuesday morning that Wednesday dinner needs fresh bread. You take dough from the refrigerator. You shape it. By evening, it is baked. No overnight planning, no soaking starters, no weekend prep work. The dough was already prepared days ago. You are simply harvesting what fermentation already did. That efficiency was not born from laziness. It was born from necessity. Families needed bread every day. They could not spend hours in the kitchen each morning. They solved the problem by shifting the work into fermentation and cold storage. Now here is what most home cooks miss about this method. They think the secret is the Dutch oven. It is not. They think the secret is the timing or the temperature. It is not that either. The real secret I promised you at the beginning of this video is something far simpler and far more powerful. The secret is that your Dutch oven is not just a cooking vessel, it is a fermentation partner. The Dutch oven's sealed environment during baking does one thing that a standard oven cannot do. It traps steam continuously. That trapped steam forces the dough to expand fully before the crust sets. In a regular oven, the moisture evaporates into the kitchen air. The crust hardens fast. The loaf cannot rise. The inside stays dense. In a Dutch oven, the steam stays inside the pot. It bathes the dough in moisture for the first half of the bake. The crust stays flexible. The dough expands. The crumb opens up. Only when you remove the lid do you allow that steam to escape and the crust to brown and crisp. But the Dutch oven itself does not create fermentation. Fermentation happens in your refrigerator before the dough ever touches the pot. The oven simply finishes what fermentation started. This is why you can pull dough from cold storage on any day of the week and have bread on the table by dinner. The fermentation work is done. The Dutch oven is just the final step. Once you understand this partnership between cold fermentation and steam-trapped baking, everything changes about how you approach bread. You stop thinking about bread as something that requires daily effort. You start thinking about it as something that works in the background. You make the dough once. Fermentation does the work. You bake when you want. The Dutch oven delivers the result. This is the inheritance your grandmother understood without naming it. She did not have modern yeast. She did not have a reliable oven. She had a crock, a cloth, cold storage, and patience. Her bread was never an emergency. It was always waiting. And because it was always waiting, her family always had bread. Not bread they had to plan for. The Pennsylvania Dutch families who have kept this method alive for 2 centuries did not do it because they were romantic or nostalgic. They did it because it worked. It still works. It works better than any no-knead trend or artisanal formula because it is not actually complicated. It is just fermentation and steam. Everything else is details. Your challenge this week is simple. If you own a Dutch oven, use it for bread. If you do not yet own one, source one. A vintage cast iron Dutch oven from an estate sale or online marketplace will serve you exactly as well as a new one. Season it if needed. Heat it. Trust the fermentation. Bake the bread. You will understand then why this method has survived for generations. The partnership between cold fermentation and a sealed Dutch oven is not new. It is not trendy. It has fed families for longer than most of us have been alive. Your job is simply to use it. I am grateful you watched this far. If you found this useful, subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next video about heritage techniques and forgotten tools. Leave a comment below and share which Dutch oven sits in your kitchen right now or which one you remember seeing in your grandmother's home. That story matters. And please activate the notification bell. New uploads arrive regularly and you will want to catch them when they land.